Hi, and welcome back. Today I'm going to talk a bit about Canon's EOS R platform and my impressions about their execution so far and what it's going to take me to get me to buy into it. To be honest, I've been thinking about this for at least a couple of months now. Pretty much ever since Canon had refurb EOS Rs on their store for like $1,800. I was real tempted to pick one up, but every time I looked, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Truth be told, in a lot of ways, I'm still on the fence about mirrorless cameras as a whole. One hand, I get the advantages. On the other, when I look at the overall costs and benefits, for me, well, those advantages aren't really that big of a deal. At least not as big of a deal as so many mirrorless proponents want to make them out to be. That said, I've also learned that I need to put something through its paces to really understand how everything shakes out. For me, this is especially true about the EOS R's touch controls, probably more than anything on that camera. But then again, when you're talking about a $2,000 camera, it's hard to just dive into something like that just to test the waters. And this is doubly the case for me too, since the EOS R is feature-wise a step down from the 5D Mark IV, and that's what I normally shoot with. Moreover, many of the missing features are things really that I use, and they aren't obviated by removing the mirror. Like, they're still important, at least to me. That said, while it's hard for me to justify getting an R, since it's more of an entry-level camera, I think Canon was right starting there and not trying to start at the pro end of the market. If they were trying to sell the EOS R as it stands, as the mirrorless counterpart to the 5D Mark IV, well, it really wouldn't stand up that well. Even against their own existing DSLR, never mind what the competition was doing. However, positioning it as the mirrorless counterpart to the 6D, well, it looks way better. Besides, if there's one thing that should be pretty obvious in the mirrorless industry, it's not as easy to produce a solid pro-level camera, at least not as most commenters sitting on the sidelines would want to believe. I mean, look at Sony. They had problems with the Alpha 9, specifically when you combined its electronic high frame rate shutter with PWM-based LED lighting, and it wasn't their first rodeo by a long shot. But it's not the cameras that really confuse me. It's the initial crop of lenses that Canon's released, and specifically the market segment those lenses seem to be targeting. When Canon released the EOS platform in 1987, they didn't just focus on L lenses. In fact, only 2 of the 14 lenses they launched in the first year carried L branding. With the RF platform, it's almost completely the opposite. Only 2 lenses released so far haven't been L lenses. Worse, the average cost of an RF mount lens is almost $2,000, and 3 of the 6 current RF mount lenses cost as much or more than the EOS R. Simply put, I don't see where Canon has an entry-level lens to go with their entry-level cameras. Take, for example, the EOS RP. It's a tier below the EOS R, and it's decidedly an entry-level camera. However, which lens did Canon pair it with in the kit? Answer: the one that's valued at 85% of the cost of the camera itself. And don't get me wrong, investing in a good glass is probably the smartest thing you can do as a photographer. But when the cameras are decidedly enthusiast level, $3,000 f2 zooms and $2,500 f1.2 primes don't seem quite right. On the other hand, now some 6-ish months after the RP launched, Canon is just launching a 24 to 240mm f3.5 to 6.3 zoom. That would have been a perfect lens to put in a kit with the RP when it launched. Heck, it would have been a perfect lens to pair with the R at launch, but they didn't have that lens ready then. Why? The RP and R didn't sneak up on Canon. That's not how engineering and manufacturing works. They knew those cameras were coming. They knew when they were going to release them. I would argue that the 24 to 240 should have been on the market when the RP was released. Even if that meant bumping something like the 28 to 70 f2L to a later release date just to get the engineering done. And of course, now it seems like Canon is working on another f2 zoom. I get that there's value in using these flagship lenses to differentiate the platform from its competition and the Canon's own EF-based DSLR line. But they're also niche products. They're gonna sell in small volumes compared to staple lenses, like for example the 16 to 200 millimeter f2.8 triad. And I really have to question how much of a market there really is in these lenses, at least in the bigger scheme of things. Sure, I'm projecting a little here. I don't have any interest in them. Then again, I can jump on pretty much any discussion forum, and there's tons of posts about people complaining about $1,000 lenses, let alone $3,000 ones. Personally, I don't see the RF 28 to 70 f2L in my future ever. And I think I'm more willing to spend money on glass than most. And when push comes to shove, it's the speed doesn't do much for me, but the weight is such a killer. The RF 28 to 70 weighs 50% more than my old EF 24 to 70 f2.8 did. I've been there. I've carried that around all day, and it's not pleasant. In fact, weight was one of the primary reasons I replaced that lens with its lighter successor. Sure, there are options. EF lenses work perfectly well on RF cameras and with the mount adapter, but Canon goes a long way to push how the RF mount is so much better. And the mount adapters, the cheapest one is at least another $100. I just can't shake the feeling that I'm missing something in Canon's strategy. 2 entry-level cameras and no native entry-level zoom. On the other hand, there's no pro-level cameras, and there's already a ton of niche, high-end pro-level glass with price tags to match. I mean, how many people are really going to spring for the $3,000 28 to 70 f2 instead of what would probably be like a $1,600 24 to 70 f2.8? Especially when the f2 lens is going to be substantially bigger and heavier. Granted, all these high-end lenses do mean that when Canon finally gets a 5D or 1D class mirrorless camera to market, they will have high-end glass for it. Then again, I wonder how important that's really going to be. This isn't like the FD to EF transition. EF glass is perfectly viable on the RF platform, and high-end users are going to have a lot of high-quality EF glass already. They'll be more than happy, I suspect, to keep using that. In fact, when I was looking at the EOS R, I wasn't looking at any of the RF glass at all. I have good glass. It's all LEF glass. I don't need to spend money on slightly different versions of lenses I already have that already perform perfectly good on the same sensor in my 5D Mark IV. And ultimately, that's kind of my problem right now. There's nothing lens-wise on the RF platform that's so compelling to me that it's a siren song I can't resist. Which I guess kind of brings me to my final point here. What does Canon have to do to get me to buy an EOS R or into the RF platform? Well, I guess if they ran a special for like $1,400 or $1,500, I'd consider an R as it currently stands. Now, that's not to say that the camera isn't worth what they're charging in general. It's just not worth that to me. I already have a pair of 5D Mark IVs, and picking up lenses, a less featured version, isn't really attractive to me. But in the broader context, I kind of want a camera that meets or beats my 5D Mark IV in terms of features. And I'm not talking about the sensor here either. Actually, if that was the only factor, I'd probably be much more keen on an R than I am. It's all the ancillary things that ruin it for me. To start with, 5 frames per second with tracking AF isn't acceptable to me. It's a step backwards from what I have. It needs to be at least 7, And honestly, given where the industry is now, I'd say 10 frames per second is a more reasonable number for a 5D class camera running in the 30 to 40 megapixel range. Actually, what I'd really like to have is the 6K hybrid photo video burst mode, so, like that Panasonic has. That would be really nice. I've already used 4K video on my 5D Mark IV this way in some instances. However, at 8.8 megapixels and a video aspect ratio frame, that isn't really ideal for photography. And cropping it down to a 3.2 image drops the res to just 7 megapixels. 6K, even in 16 by 9 aspect ratio, gives a much more reasonable 21 megapixel image to start with, which is something I can at least actually print and do things with. Secondly, I want full control over the AF system with multiple rear AF on buttons, similar to what I have on my 5D Mark IV. There's nothing inherent in a mirrorless camera that obviates the need to control the AF system. The R, like the 6D, doesn't have this, and the 5D does, and it's a big stumbling block for me. Third, I want a GPS unit in the camera. I don't care for the R's Bluetooth link to a smartphone solution. Personally, I want all the battery drain from my camera to stay in my camera. Moreover, there's a lot of times I want to be able to turn my phone off to preserve battery life, or just keep it from disrupting me at all, and still geotag my pictures. And no, airplane mode just doesn't work in this case. Turning that on disables the GPS system. As for video features, what I'd really like to see is probably decidedly different from what I've seen constantly trotted out online. To start with, I'm not all that bothered by the 1.7x crop for 4K shooting on my 5D Mark IVs. In fact, there's many times where I shoot in that mode deliberately for the crop and then downsample the video files to 1080p after the fact. Depth of field doesn't go away just because it's video, and a 1.7x crop gets me a stop and 2/3 more depth of field for the same composition and aperture value. That said, one thing I'd really like to see is better control over the output resolutions. Not that this only applies to the RF platform either. On the 5D Mark IV, I have DCI 4K and 1080p. On the EOS R, there's Ultra HD 4K and 1080p. What I'd really like is to have the option of both DCI and Ultra HD 4K modes, and a similar choice between 2K and 1080p for high def. Moreover, I'd really like to have an in-camera downscaled 2K or 1080p format. I'm already doing this with some of my video shooting, where I shoot it in 4K and then downsample it to 1080p after the fact. But it would be nice if I could skip that step and have the camera do it for me, if only to have 1080p sized files in the field. Ultimately, I'm really curious to see what Canon has in store for higher-end mirrorless cameras. There's rumor that they've accelerated the work on a 1D class camera, which would certainly be interesting. That said, I think they need to really bring a lot more of the DSLR ergonomics to it. Additionally, there's talk about a high-resolution 5DS style model. Though again, for me at least, the ergonomics are going to be a big factor in whether or not that's really a higher-end camera. Well, I think I've rambled enough about the EOS R and RF platform here, so I'm going to just wrap this up at this point. If you like this, please smash the thumbs up button and subscribe. If not, well, you already know what to do. For more detailed written content on photography, travel, and camera gear, please visit my website at www.pointsandfocus.com. Also, you can find me on Twitter at pointsandfocus.